Make a chevron pattern jumbo chenille chunky yarn hand knit blanket with Bicozy jumbo yarn. It's an inch thick and super soft. You're going to take your oatmeal colored beige yarn. You're going to need 4 of those and 3 of the white. You're making a slip knot that brings you your first loop, and you gauge it with about 2 fingers inside the loop. Make a chain foundation. This is the base of where you will add your stitches. Come down my lane and check out my video explaining the slip knot and chain foundation. I gauge my chain loops about 3 inches. You'll make 16 loops, which are the measurement of the width you want your blanket. Now turn your chain over. Take the working yarn and pull through the end loop and make a knit stitch. Next, find the middle bump on your chain and make your knit stitches. Gauge your knit stitch loop with your finger. Continue finding the middle bumps on your chain and make your first row of knit stitches. You're pulling the working yarn through the middle bump to make the knit stitches. Make sure to knit stitch through the bump that's next to the knot. You have your tail knot and working yarn on the left, and see how the bottom chain border looks. Place your white working yarn strand on the left. Bring up the white yarn behind the last knit stitch with the tail out on the left. Pull the yarn through and make your knit stitches along this row, gauging your loops as you knit. This begins a continuous yarn where you won't need to stop and cut to add each color on each row. As you come to the end of this row, pull the working yarn down and through the lower end loop, making a knit stitch loop. This will be your right side of your chain border, so you'll set that aside and continue making a second row of white knit stitches. Finishing that row, you will notice 2 oatmeal and 2 white rows. Now take your oatmeal or your beige working yarn and place it under and up to the first white knit stitch loop and pull through. You are continuing your beige yarn from the lower beige rows. Continue in this pattern, making your knit stitches across this row. You can see the pattern starting to form. At the end of this beige row, pull the working yarn down and through the white end loop and up, adding to the chain border. You'll keep making another row of beige knit stitches. You can see how the right side of the blanket is forming. So when finishing this row, you're going to take your white working yarn up and behind the beige knit stitch and make your white knit stitch loop. Your beige working yarn is now on your left. Continue making your white knit stitches along this row. Now coming to the end of this row, bring your white working yarn down through the beige end loop and up, making your chain border knit stitch. Continue with the white yarn and knitting across this row. It's good to count your loops, making sure you don't skip. So by now, hopefully you're getting the hang of how this pattern works, bringing the continuous yarn up and behind the next knit stitch, continuing across, adding your knit stitches, and then also adding a second row of the same color as you come back. You'll notice that the back has a different pattern. I love how this jumbo chenille chunky yarn blanket is turning out. So you will run out of yarn throughout making this blanket. You just need to cut your yarn in a flat top, move the yarn away from the center plastic cord, and then use a lighter to light up the center plastic cord. Then you will mash the yarn to fuse together. When it cools down, you can continue knitting. The last 2 rows of your blanket will be beige, so making the border, you will make larger loops about 3 fingers. They make the loops to cast off your blanket. Sandwich the 2 loops together with the working yarn behind. The right hand pulls a working yarn through the loops to the left, creating a loop. You'll sandwich that loop to the next loop and over to do the same process until you reach the end of the row. After making that last loop, cut the working yarn and with the last row loop and bottom end loop sandwich together and pull the yarn through, making a knot, and then you'll braid it through the chain border. You'll do the same with the beginning left bottom tails. You can also cut the yarn off of the remaining tails and light the center of the yarn and attach to your border, letting it cool. Once you learn the pattern, you can take an afternoon and make this blanket. Come down my lane at Cobble Creek Lane for more DIYs, home decor, and crafts.